All right, so today we're going to put some notes in our jam regarding how we're going to begin putting fractions together or subtracting fractions. So I'm first going to start off by reminding ourselves about our renaming of fractions from last week. So at the top I'm going to write renaming fractions. And we talked about two ways to rename fractions. The first one, last Wednesday, we talked about renaming in higher terms. Higher terms is when we want to find common denominators. So use when you need common denominators. And so if I had a fraction, let's say that was 1/2, and we wanted to think about putting that with a fraction like 3/4, we don't have common denominators here. So we would want to rename one of our fractions so that we have common denominators. So one thing we would be able to do is take our smaller denominator value, 1/2, and we can think about multiplying by that value of 1, because as we've been making our factor book, we've noticed that every factor has that number 1 in common, and that when we multiply by that value, we're not changing the value. So we can multiply by our wonderful 1 to get an equivalent. And so if I'm wanting to get to that denominator of 4, I have to think about how I can do that. So what could I do to the number 2 to get the number 4? Well, I could multiply by 2, and then I could multiply by 2 on the top, because 2 over 2 is our friendly number 1. And when I do that on the top and the bottom, I have created an equivalent called 2/4. 2/4 is equivalent to 1/2. So that's using our wonderful 1 and multiplying. We did that lesson in engineering equivalence. We also said that some of us are more comfortable using the 4th grade method of making an EFT. And so when we make an EFT, we're just simply skip counting by that value on the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we're using the value on the bottom, the denominator amount, to skip count on the bottom. So we have 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. All of these values are equivalent to 1/2. So we can choose two methods. Yes, wonderful 1 is more efficient, which is what we want to try to get to by the end of 5th grade. But using our EFT is something that's a little more familiar that you can remember from 4th grade. So that's talking about higher terms. We also talked about lower terms. And we wanted to know, well, why is it important to know about lower terms? Because BC stands for because all 5th grade answers are in lowest terms. So last Thursday, we completed a different engineering equivalence practice in which we were taking a fraction name and we were simplifying, we were making it simple with a smaller fraction name. So I'm going to show you or remind you how we did that last week. So one thing that we did last week was we took the fraction 12/18. And we said first that 12 was kind of high and so was 18. And we thought that there was probably another name for this fraction amount. And so when I think about the number 12 and 18, I want to go to my factor book and I want to find a number 1. And because we want this value to be smaller, the action that we're choosing to use here is division. So now we're using our wonderful number 1 and we're going to be dividing to find an equivalent represented with smaller numbers. So when I pull out my factor book and I look at the numbers for 12, and you should have your numbers for 12 in your booklet, and those numbers look like this. So I'm going to record my numbers down. My numbers for 12 are 1, 12, 3, 4, 6, and 12. And now I'm going to flip over to my numbers for 18. And so my numbers for 18 in my flip book are 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, and 18. You want to look for the greatest common factor, the GCF. Look for the greatest common factor that the two numbers share. So while I see that they both share a 2 and I see that they both share a 3, I'm noticing that the highest number that they share is the number 6. And when we use our greatest common factor, we will get a simplified answer the first time. So I'm going to disguise my number 1 as 6/6. Now all I need to do is divide by my friendly number 1 to get my lower terms answer. And sometimes division scares us, so we can think the opposite, multiply, to help us figure out what that is. So if I think about something times 6, that will give me 12, or 12 divided by 6, that number that would go in the blank would be 2. And if I want to think about something times 6 to get 18, or 18 divided by 6, that number would be 3. So our new lower equivalent fraction name for 12/18 is 2/3. So that's what we did last week, boys and girls. We talked about higher terms and we talked about lower terms. Now what we're going to be doing is putting the two fractions together. We're going to be adding and subtracting. But now we are going to be putting together things or subtracting things with unlike denominators. Last year, I know that you put fractions together with like denominators. This year in 5th grade, we're going to put fractions together or separate fractions with unlike denominators. And that's where I find a checklist is going to be helpful. So if you'll write down these 4 steps with me, when we're adding today, we can use these steps to help guide us. Step number 1 is to set up the problem. Set up the problem. So if we're talking about putting together 2 fractions, let's say we have 2/5 and we want to put that together with 1/4. I just set up my problem. Step number 2 says that we need to find common denominators. So we're going to find common denominators, and we can do that 2 ways. We could use our wonderful 1, or we could just use our EFT because it's something that we're comfortable and familiar with. So when I look at these two fraction amounts, I can see that I have unlike denominators, and I'm going to need to find common denominators. So right below that, I'm going to make an EFT for 2/5, and then I'm going to make one for 1/4. And I'm going to have to write very neatly when I make this EFT. So an equivalent could be 4/10. An equivalent could be 6/15. An equivalent could be 8/20. And I'm going to stop right there because I'm thinking if I count by 4s, I might be able to get to 20 also. So let's see. An equivalent to 1/4 could be 2/8. An equivalent could be 3/12. An equivalent could be 4/16. Or it might be 5/20. And I do see that denominator 20 being shared by both factors. So now I'm going to circle 8/20 and I'm going to circle 5/20. Sometimes we only have to make one E chart to find common denominators, and we'll practice that in class. But the next step that I'm going to write down would be to rewrite with the new fraction name. So that's going to be, another name for 2/5 would be 8/20. And another name for 1/4 would be 5/20. And now that I have common denominators, I'm able to easily put my numerators together. So 8 plus 5 is 13. And of course, my denominator is not going to be added. And I get a new fraction amount of 13/20. So my last step that I'm going to record would be the last step, which says solve, which is what I've just done over here to the left or to the right. But I always want to ask myself a simple question. Is this answer in lowest terms? And that's going to be the question that you're going to always want to end with. So when I think about factors for 13 and factors for 20, I get my factor book out and I flip on over to the number 13. And here's what I notice. There are only two factors for the number 13, 1 and 13. And when I flip over to the number 20, there are many factors, but they don't share any of the ones that I shared with 13. So since there are no common factors, then there's no greatest common factor. And that means that 13/20 is our smallest, most simplified answer there is.